Welcome to the OmniBOR meeting that we have. Do we have anyone that is new?
I don't think so. I mean, I think
So
Mark's been around a couple of times. I did want to mention, by the way, I neglected to stick the link into the chat recently for people to add themselves to the attendees list or add items to the agenda. So I've just done that again.
Thank you very much. So we have upcoming events and CFPs. I will say the CFP for the security village should have opened up or should be imminent. So make sure to follow up with that as well.
Okay, that's good to know. I know we discussed that for some time and it wasn't clear what was going on with that. And so it sounds like it's starting to get its act together.
Yeah, it sounds like it's finally coming together. There was I kept on asking as well, like when this is going to happen. So I don't know if that had an effect or not, but hopefully. So, cool. In terms of CFP, can we open it up real quick just to make sure we're not blowing through any dates?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, we have CFPs. Everything that is on the list is currently closed. So I'll have to make sure that as things pop up, we'll populate that. KubeCon CFPs for the next ones to be announced, but it'll very likely be a few weeks after KubeCon. At least that's the normal trend. So
it's very stressful when it's announced before KubeCon, I must say.
Yeah, that was a change that we made, was to put it afterwards. It causes more stress to the program committee because they have less time, but it's the right thing to do. Cool. Okay, so the next one is we have a reminder to reach out to language and build tool. Is there anything that we want to discuss on this at the moment, or should we park it until things settle down a bit more?
So I vaguely remember, Dave, that you had something from last week, but I don't know whether it's something that would have moved forward at all in the intervening week.
Yeah, I did have a broad-ranging conversation with some of the folks in the Oracle JVM security group. And Omnibor was part of that, but I don't think that I've got a call to action right now. I want to let things settle for a little while with the person that I talked to, and then I'll follow up with basically some of their adjuncts.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sounds good. No, that's roughly on par for expectations for any sort of engagement. You start slowly and move and accelerate as you go.
Sorry, I got kicked off. Cool. So we have meeting times. I've not put a doodle poll out yet, primarily because I've been sick. I will put one out shortly.
Yeah, for those of you who may or not have been here last week, sadly, I have a perma conflict at the bottom of the hour that I cannot get out of that's popped up. And so there was some discussion, and we're going to potentially look at moving meeting times as a result. But look forward to the doodle poll, Frederick.
Will do. Cool. Proof of concept. So last time we spoke about the verifiable SBOMs and SBOMit.dev. Do we want to discuss more on this, or it is, because I think we covered this last week. I would like to put together a quick demo or something similar on this to show what's happening in that particular space, but that can be for a later time.
Okay. No, I vaguely recall this being mentioned last time. Does anyone else feel the need to do a brief revisit of it here today?
Not hearing anything, so let's jump towards questions from implementers. So, not hearing any questions at the moment. So let's jump over to notable. We have notable options.
I've left this in the agenda primarily as a reminder, and this is actually something that I should probably go push a PR for now that we've merged the changes to the spec to bring the input manifest language into the spec. So, because right now they're basically got a place for an artifact, an ADG, an artifact dependency graph identifier in the SPDX spec, and I think we would really like to have that be the place for the input for an input manifest ID, given the languaging that we've recently merged to the spec. But this has become a bit ripe. Yeah, it's become ripe now, and so probably should go do that. But that's why I've sort of left it in the agenda as a reminder.
Okay. So we have active discussions. We have Omnibor a document on Omnibor benefits that is being currently worked on. So I'm not seeing Ava on the call. Was there anyone else who worked on this document?
So I haven't done anything new with it since last week.
Okay. Is there any help that you want or anything that you wanted to discuss?
Well, so this was something that Ava had put in a note last week about the idea of dedicating 20 minutes during each meeting call to basically discuss the use case and sort of work on it collaboratively during the meeting. If we want to do that, I think that could sort of be the thing to work on now. Where I had basically left off was that I've produced this sort of categories of stakeholders list within the use cases document, and then had started to go through those categories of stakeholders and try to describe the theoretical benefits of Omnibor to that category. Basically, I find this is a good way to produce a list of benefits.
So real quick, before we jump into this in depth, let me just double check. So Ed, you have a hard stop at the half-hour mark. Do you have anything else urgent before we jump into this topic for the next 20 minutes? Or should we just jump in?
I wouldn't specify it as intrinsically urgent, but I will highlight the fact that I think the comments for insertion of Omnibor IDs stuff is probably pretty close to being ready. And I would also like to touch on the new idea for non-embedded mode again, which we discussed in the past. Neither of those are necessarily urgent, but those are two things that I had prepared for discussion today.
Would you be okay? Andrew, would you be okay with covering those first, and then we jump back and we'll spend the 20 minutes on this?
Yeah, sure.
Fantastic. Cool, Ed, you got the floor on these two topics.
Okay, so on the comment for insertion of Omnibor IDs, this is something that there's been a great deal of discussion on, but the fundamental spec that we had put together for this came down to being effectively more or less this, which is we went through and added an Appendix C for source embedding. And this was primarily for allowing tools that generate source code files or that transform source code files to insert it on Omnibor ID. So you could imagine, for example, like the classic example for this is patch. patch transform source code files. We actually have some POC work where we have a POC version of patch that will go ahead and stamp the files, so we can track the provenance of patches that get applied to files. But you could imagine this being used for things like JavaScript minifiers or CSS minifiers or all kinds of things that do these sorts of behaviors. And the effective idea is pretty straightforward, and I think we were pretty okay with mostly, which is that you sort of borrow a line from everything else. You say, look, you stick a comment line that has something like an Omnibor input manifest ID : we sort of borrowed that from SPDX, and then in between square brackets, a comma separated list of input manifest identifiers, so as to support the rule of two, where we got the SHA-1 and SHA-256 schizoids. And so for something that supports C-like semantics, for comments, you would put it after a pair of slashes. For something that supports shell-style comments, you would put it after a £. You could imagine using whatever the native commenting is. In terms of placement of the Omnibor ID comment line, I think we'd finally settled on the best place to put it, given all the other crazy things that happen in comment lines, was to place it as the last line in the source code file, and precede it by a blank line to ensure that it's not interpreted as part of another comment block. And then with the comment that a tool reading the source code file should interpret the last Omnibor input manifest ID that it finds as being governing. And so an example of what this would look like, for something like Go, you would end up sticking a comment line like this at the end of it. For something like C, you would end up, if you started with a sort of a C input like this, you would end up with a output that looks roughly like this. And then tools which mutate this, we basically said many source code generated tools like patch specifically mutate existing files. And so if you are mutating an existing file, then you may optionally either replace an existing Omnibor input manifest ID if found, or insert your Omnibor input manifest ID normally, which would cause it to be after any other lines in the file because you're sticking it at the end. Does that sound familiar to folks?
Yep.
And I think the only outstanding question I recall us having on this was someone had observed that this can be a little bit long for linters, because the line, just the IDs themselves tend to be a bit long. And so this might be a bit long for linters that may want something that's shorter. And I don't know really if there's anything we can do about that. I'm certainly open to ideas. We could have, of course, just declare that's not going to be a problem we're going to concern ourselves with.
Yeah, anyway,
Any
the
other?
256 hashes are over 80 characters, so there's nothing much we can do anyway. That's the nature of the information.
Yeah. So even trying to split across multiple lines wouldn't get us below 80 characters.
I mean, that would make it more awkward, right? If you split the lines, then you have to make sure you read it back right and all that.
No, I concur. It makes things harder for tool developers. It makes it harder for things like grep. And so it makes it harder for tool users, and it doesn't really solve the linter problem. So any other thoughts, opinions that folks have on this? Andrew, might I impose upon you for a quick pass over this for next time, so we can in principle merge it next time?
Sure.
As we have demonstrated historically, you are very good at making sure that things are well written, and I am very not.
No problem. I can take a pass.
Many thanks. I'll add a note down here at the bottom. All right. Excellent. And then the other one I wanted to bring up was the non-embed mode idea. I've mentioned this before, and I think we should have gone off to think about it a little bit. So we've repeatedly had come up that there are scenarios in which supporting a mode that does not embed the Omnibor ID in the resulting artifact can be highly beneficial. The classic example of this that's really easy to understand is one of the things Yonghui has done with his tooling is create tooling that in a non-embed mode will allow you to completely reproduce pre-existing Debian packages that are then byte for byte identical to the ones that have previously been published by the Debian project, but for which we then have non-embed mode artifact dependency graphs, which can be really, really useful. And so if we want to have a non-embed mode, then one of the fundamental questions we need to ask is, if you are operating in a non-embed mode, how do you figure out the input manifest of some artifact you're taking as input if you're a build tool? And so one of the ideas that I was toying with was to say, well, what if we simply construct a file that captures that in roughly the same format that we've been doing thus far, right? So if I have an example file, foo.o, that's the name of the output file, and foo.o has an artifact ID that looks like Gitoid blob SHA-1, and the input manifest ID for foo.o is this, then you could write into some location with foo.o something like a foo.o.omnibor that simply is an Omnibor formatted file, so it tells you what kind of SHA it is. It has a blob with the blob ID of the output artifact, and it has a bomb with the input manifest. And that was sort of the first pass of the idea. And of course, it begs the questions of how to handle dual tree and what should the suffix be, because I'm not a huge fan of using the .omnibor suffix personally. There was a conversation that went on about trying to stick them in the same file using YAML style separators. And then there was a suggestion that maybe the way to handle this is to stick something into the metadata directory in like a mapping subdirectory where we separate, it's similar to how we do in the object directory for these files, by the artifact identifier type. And then we index by the output artifact ID. So if I've got an output artifact ID and it doesn't have an embedded input manifest, I could go look for input manifests in this directory for that object ID. And if I find them, then I have an input manifest and I can work from there. So wanted to sort of throw this out there, open it up for thoughts and comments. Please don't take the idea too rigidly. There are lots of details in the idea that I'm not terribly fond of in terms of naming particularly, but I wanted to sort of open this up and see what thought about a potential use. This is a potential way to handle the non-embed case.
I think this is doable and also helps establish the mapping between the output artifact ID and the input manifest, how to reach the input manifest from there. Instead of mapping, it could be a artifact dependency graph or something else. ADG, that is metadata / ADG / something, or another appropriate naming convention for that.
Yeah, I'm particularly in the market for replacement namings for mapping.
Mm-hmm.
Do other folks have thoughts? So not many.
Thing is, if you say non-embedding, and if the so if the input object files have already some embedded information, then it also means you remove them, right? Does it well, what do I Okay, only the output will not be. I'm sorry, I think that was a lame question. Yeah. Okay.
It's fine. Someone else was trying to speak?
Well, I like the idea of using ADG because mapping, it's just a bit more direct than saying mapping in this case. And I do like the idea of the directory structure to delineate this.
Okay.
You know, have we considered, so we've talked about sort of embedding, non-embedding. Would it be reasonable, so instead of, almost like there's a middle point, that you can have the manifest be written to disk somewhere external to the binary, not, you know, embedded in the ELF data, but have the having the manifest's own identifier put into the binary metadata, so that the binary basically says, okay, here is the artifact identifier for my manifest, and then you have the manifest that's written somewhere else.
That's actually the way the spec is currently written.
Okay,
right?
that's
So like if you look at the ELF embedding, you're writing the input manifest ID into the artifact.
Okay, so this is okay. Good. That's good to clarify. So then, but then this, when we say alternate non-embedding proposal, this is to basically say, okay, don't even do that.
Right, because there are use cases where you don't want to, and like I said, the simplest use case where you don't want to is the example that Young Kuei did with essentially, you might call it a brownfield example, but since 99.99% of the world is brownfield, it's an important one, where if I have an existing package that I felt like a Debian package, right? If I rebuild that and I do embedding, then I'm going to produce a different package for byte comparison. And so if you wanted to, for example, catalog the artifact dependency graphs for the entire existing Debian repo, such that if I pick up a Debian package, I could go look up the artifact dependency graph. Right. Then you would need to do that in a non-embedding mode.
So I think there can be a combination of non-embedding and embedding. This non-embedding just provide, you know, a mapping, right? This mapping actually, it can still work even if we do the embedding during compiler compilation, right? So this is just on top. This is just extra things. Even if we're embedding, this mapping still works, still can work, right? Consider the BOMS working over the OmniBOR enabled compiler, right? That approach.
Yeah. And so what I would sort of add, absolutely, and what I sort of would advocate is that, you know, even if you're doing embedding, you probably want to write the mapping file for the non-embedding case, just so that, you know, that's around. And if, for example, you're dealing with an artifact that has an embedding type that you don't understand, right, then it may have embedding, but you may also have the mapping file, and you may end up using the mapping file because you don't understand the peculiarities of that particular file format's embedding.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Exactly.
I do apologize. I do have to run to the hard stop that I have. But I appreciate the time. Thank you. Could someone else share the agenda, hopefully, now that I'm having to leave?
Let me make sure I claim the host so it doesn't kick everyone off.
Oh, let's do that, yes.
Okay, I'm host now.
Cool.
So I'm on a cell phone, so I cannot share the agenda out right now.
I think I can. Give me just a moment.
Thanks.
Oh, host disabled participant screen sharing.
Moment, I'm trying to find on the app. Usually there's a security icon on the bottom, and it's hidden it because I do not join as the host. But I found it. Okay, try again.
All right, cool. There we go. All right, that should be sharing now. Let me scroll back down. All right, so we're still on the non-embed mode, right?
I believe so. So now that Ed's jumped out of the call, I don't know if we can meaningfully continue on this particular conversation or not.
Yeah.
We can if someone wants to.
I mean, it seemed like in general there was some support and interest for doing this. I think, you know, agreement that mapping is probably not the right name. I think, you know, ADG seems pretty reasonable. And then I suppose, excuse me, we can bike shed how we want to, you know, separate these things. We want this to just be flat or folders or, you know, so on. But I think in general, it seems like the idea is supported. So yeah, I think it seems good to leave it there.
Cool. So with that, I recommend we jump back to the 20-minute session that we were discussing before.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so this is the use cases document. So basically, like I was saying, you've got these categories of stakeholders, which, excuse me, I will say, if anyone thinks of additional categories, you know, if this isn't complete, feel free to add more stuff. This is just sort of my initial list. And then from there, trying to figure out, okay, if you are, you know, one of these categories, what do you care about? Like in what way does this benefit you? I've gotten through some stuff for maintainers and for package users. And then it's had put in the title, but had not yet filled out anything for open source program offices at for-profit companies. This is imagining, like, you know, if you're the OSPO at a, I don't know, let's say Amazon, like, why do you care? What would this benefit you? But if you'd like, we could go through a little bit of what I put for the previous ones. And I will say with these benefits, some of these are, you know, if we imagine a world where Omnibor is widespread, and sort of generally available and integrated with other things, recognizing that not all of these benefits would be achieved immediately. So for open source maintainers, you know, one of the ideas that's been raised previously is tying Omnibor identifiers, artifact identifiers into CVEs. And I'll say as well, like, you know, we're saying CVEs, but really this could be a placeholder for other vulnerability tracking systems. You have like the GitHub security advisories or OSV from Google. But the basic idea that, you know, if you have a vulnerability that's reported, that'd be great if you could tie it to the specific artifacts, specific sort of parts of a package, so that someone can figure out if they are affected, perhaps even in cases of someone, let's say, copying stuff from an open source project and, you know, copying a file and plugging it in, that, you know, at least so long as it's at the file level that you've copied, you can identify, you know, shared artifact identifiers that indicate the commonality and allow you to know that you're impacted by this CVE. So that's one. I was thinking sort of stronger attestation of build contents for binaries distributed to users on the shovel. So, you know, sometimes if a product is providing artifacts, they'll provide a checksum to say, like, hey, after you've downloaded it, you know, you can use this to verify that it wasn't modified in transit. I will say it doesn't seem super common anymore, and I know that a number of projects that sort of don't do this at all. But, you know, if you are doing this, you can imagine that you get even sort of stronger attestations of how an artifact was built if you have the manifest inside of it that says, hey, here's the contents of the package. All right, and then for package users, sort of imagining that if you have artifact identifiers, you have manifests that exist for two different versions of something, you get a sort of finer grained description of exactly what has changed without having to go through the commit history yourself. At the very least, it sort of lets you figure out, okay, these specific files have changed, and then you can go and diff those specific files if you want to. And then also, this is really on the consumer side of if you're checking against CVE disclosures or VEX, which is the vulnerability exploitability interchange or something like that, exchange format, which is basically about projects that want to say in a machine readable way whether they are affected by a particular CVE or not. Basically, if those are tied into Omnibor, you can imagine being able to sort of filter those more quickly to figure out if you're impacted by a specific vulnerability. So those are things that I've filled in. First of all, I guess, does anyone have uses that they could imagine adding to either of these categories?
Do we want to point to any prior art as well? Like, we have things like NixOS as an example, or the Nix system that has some overlap in not necessarily the way they do things, but things like cryptographically verifiable manifest that ties into what's actually within the package, and they have the ability to tell when something changes upstream, or rather, when something changes earlier, then they have a way to tell as to what packages are affected pretty quickly. And this is something that I think we can bring to, like, this particular capability is something that we certainly bring to system administrators who are trying to operate.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the ideas then, I guess, is that Omnibor, if it's sort of is offering a similar thing, that you can sort of bring in this capability to more context. It's allowing you to do it in places where you're not necessarily going to switch to Nix. I think that's a good one. I think it's probably also worthwhile comparing to, I should probably even say salsa provenance attestations.
There's a tie-in for salsa provenance attestation through the SBOMIT path. In that SBOMIT is an in toto, is effectively in toto that's been set up in a specific way. Your salsa level 1 provenance, if you read through and you map to the capabilities of SBOM and you map to the capabilities of in toto, and it may have changed recently because they've been doing updates to salsa, but historically mapped better to in toto because it was targeting process as opposed to targeting SBOM. So SBOM would have been like further down the chain, like maybe salsa level provenance 2 or 3, when that starts to enter into it. But the Omnibor, rather the Gitoid is of the inputs and outputs are tracked as part of SBOMIT, which gives us a link to in toto, which gives us a link to salsa provenance attestations at a deep level if all that is successful.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so that would be something to address. And I suppose, so I'm just writing these down in the notes right now about comparisons in prior art. There's the question of when we get into actually sort of drafting the language of this, because this is all just producing kind of initial stuff that'll go into the document, whether we want the comparisons in prior art to be a distinct document, if we want it to be a part of the use cases, or sort of how that can be presented. But I think it's worthwhile to address. And actually, if anyone can put in just like the link to SBOMIT, just because I would like to read more about it. And I know it came up a little bit during last week's conversation as well.
Okay. Yeah, and I think the same thing can be said as well with, like, perhaps part of it is not just prior art, but if by listing some of the prior art, we can actually think about how we could enhance the capabilities of those particular things. So, like, SBOMIT by itself does a particular action. It sort of like sandwiches, like, here are the inputs and here are the output hashes and Gitoids in a specific way. It does allow you to attach into source. But being able to say this is on this is specifically Omnibor, and it can provide us with deeper information that when you compile an artifact, you could also look at in a standardized way, work out all of the inputs that have gone into it from the compiler itself. Like that just makes that attestation so much stronger, and also gives us a stronger guarantee that nothing was brought in from that was unexpected or unseen, because like they can scan source code directories and so on, and they can even look at system calls to see what was pulled in, but what was actually used, like who knows. And so I think, do we want to call in prior art, do we want to call out things like SBOMs as well, or is that far enough away that that it doesn't really make sense calling it out?
No, I mean, I think we can be like, because this is at the moment, this document is basically just notes. I feel fine being over inclusive, recognizing that not everything might make it into the use cases document, but things can shape our thinking and how we express what we're doing, even if they're not going to be reflected in the final document. So sure,
Okay,
we can put stuff in about SBOMs. I think, you know, one of the relevant connections with SBOMs in general, and so obviously I guess with SBOMs you can have differing levels of granularity. You could have an SBOM which just expresses the kind of what I'll call the package level dependencies. It's, you know, hey, we depend on this package, which depends on that package. You know, it has the ability as well to express file contents, to say like, oh, this dependency has these files, and you know, you can express, you can put that in an SPDX. You know, I think augmenting that with Omnibor IDs is I mean, just valuable. You know, I think that what's worthwhile here would probably be delineating the difference between them, because I think because these are both kind of new things, when teaching about them to people, you want to avoid the confusion of thinking that they're doing the same thing or that they are the same thing.
That's an excellent point as well, and it's quite unfortunate that SBOM is like an umbrella term the way that it is, because you're exactly right in that people are producing like RPM QA and piping that to a text file and adding a little bit of extra metadata on who owns or who produced or similar, and saying, oh, this is from Red Hat and it's being operated by being incorporated and so on. That's our SBOM.
Right.
And it's not unreasonable, but it does show that there's a gap there, because compared to something that's pulling in the source. And yeah, I can totally see the stuff that we're doing. If our stuff were to be pulled in that way, we could help bridge that gap as well. So even if someone produces only that, and the hashes to show that which package it was that got pulled in, that combination should be enough to cryptographically trace everything on the condition that the compilers or manifest are not lying.
Yeah. Yeah. Just as a side note, and this is just personal complaint about the supply chain space right now, is everything getting the word BOM attached to it, and I am glad that we didn't do that. I mean, we have BOR, which is not, you know, it's only one letter difference, but I'm glad at least that we didn't stick BOM on our name.
We almost did. I mean,
Yeah.
we initially did. But no, I completely agree. Especially now we see like system BOM and runtime BOM, and I'm waiting for him to produce a human BOM, and it's like, at what point does it stop?
Yeah.
But
Well, a number of these things aren't even really BOMs, which drives me up the wall. So yeah. All right. So we have NixOS, Salsa, SBOM it, SBOMs in general. Do we think that there are other things worth calling out as sort of relevant background?
so there is a specific thing that I like the idea of. I'll use NPM. Oh, we should call out. actually, let me be a little bit more tempered in what I'm going to say. If you look at how NPM is securing their system, or what they've been building out, is a build system that NPM itself owns and controls, similar to like a GitHub action or similar, that when it picks up off a repository, it'll perform a build and package. And what it's producing at the end of that is a in toto attestation. Part of that in toto attestation is that it will link the source code repository as part of the manifest metadata, as in terms of where it pulled the source from. Like if I pulled it from Git, from this commit ID, and that gets cryptographically signed, and then you can look at that at a later time. So what's nice in this particular sense is that gives us a tie-in to the source code at that particular point. One of the things that I think we have an opportunity to do, and this may be orthogonal to OmniBOR, but I think it's still an important one, is that let's say that we're using a specific JavaScript or node library. Let's say we're pulling in Express, right? And because it's linked to the source code at that particular time, that gives us an opportunity to make attestations about that specific commit ID itself. And that further analysis of that commit ID, additional metadata could be created and stored about it that allows that to basically grow and becomes like sort of a public record. And so you can have a company that comes along, like let's say Google were to do this. Google could say that, hey, this is Google, and these are the attestations. These are what my security analysts said about it. We did a code audit. Microsoft might do the same thing. Apple might do the same thing, or so on. And that gives you information about that specific thing at a specific baseline. I think the same effect could occur at the source code level for certain things. So we could say a specific source code file has gone through a specific analysis or a specific revision. So even if it's not tied to like the specific version of NPM that's being pulled in, which is actually a really good spot to do it, but to be able to tie that to a more generic space as well might be an interesting path. I don't know if it would work out or not from a culture perspective, but I think it would be something that we could possibly enable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Okay, so and thinking through this, because it seems like the basic idea, what you're describing, and if I've missed anything, correct me if I'm wrong. If you're doing, so if you have, let's say, a code auditing system, and I'm gonna, just because I'm a Rust person, I'm gonna imagine that you're using something like Cargo Crev, which is a sort of distributed, like kind of web of trust based code review system. People can do audits of some crate, and then through Cargo Crev, they basically can disseminate the information that, hey, I've audited this crate, and here are my findings. And over time, basically, the idea is that through Cargo Crev, you have this mechanism to gather these audits and sort of get, if you have a particular package you want to use, you can check what's in Crev and have some confidence in the safety of the thing that you're going to use. With the addition of Omnibor, you could basically say, okay, it's not just that I've audited this specific commit, but actually that within the commit, these files had these artifact identifiers, and they haven't changed relative to when the audit was performed. And so you can basically say, like, okay, this, for the purposes of these files, this audit is still good because they haven't actually changed.
Exactly. And or if you know when the audit occurred and you know what baseline, maybe there's a set of things they look for, then that also gives you that information as well, because you have a metadata about, like, let's say that I ran, like, let's say I was running like a code auditing company, and I had like 3 levels of auditing. Like, one is like scanning, 2 is like we'll look at the areas that users will actively touch, and 3 is like everything. It's like knowing what level it was at and at a timestamp, at a certain time, point in time, maybe like OWASP creates a new, maybe we're targeting only OWASP top 10 for like level 2, and that changes over time. So knowing what the parameters were there, time, and what rubric they followed can become important as part of that. But the most important aspect of that, I think, is going to be like who did it and what was done and when was it done. Because if you say that something has to be done on a quarterly basis, or let's say 6-month basis, right? Like a code audit or something sort of that. Even if nothing has changed, but your policy says it has to be done in that given period of time, like that's a decision that I make as to how I want to trust that system or not. You may have a different opinion on how you want to do it. Like maybe you're okay with a yearly audit, or maybe you're really stringent. You're working something that's like national security. You want to have it done quarterly. So it's like we may have different bars, but once it's done, the ability to post information back to the public, I think is important. The same way that CPEs report back to the public at some point with some embargo period.
Yeah, no, I think that all makes a lot of sense. If you want to, I don't know, I'm sort of keeping the notes relatively brief. If you wanted to add more about this in the notes here, feel free. I also, I added an item here about, so, and part of this is just one of the stuff that I work on, where I have a history of doing sort of secure code reviews. You know, often with those, you're using both tools and human analysis, and you're finding weaknesses, which are not necessarily currently exploitable vulnerabilities, but are sort of the, you know, kinds of things that can become vulnerabilities in the future. And, you know, you do some filtering, some of those are going to end up being false positives, but, you know, you basically do find things that are, you know, somewhere in the spectrum of just poor coding practice, or, you know, in other cases, something that, you know, would be exploitable if not for, but, you know, some sort of other specifics of the code right now. So it's a kind of thing that's like a time bomb of, you know, this would probably eventually become a vulnerability, you know, if the software around it changes in the future.
Yeah, or this is a vulnerability, but because like the point that I'm trying to get here is not just about detection, but like imagine that you're pulling in a specific like library, right? And you discover that there is an issue with the router in that library that is currently unpatched. Patch is imminent, but it's actively being exploited, and you have a sense as to how it's being exploited. So you could possibly run up to your intrusion prevention systems and configure them to stop things that have a certain pattern or certain filter, and spin them up in front of your systems. And how do you know which systems you should spin them up in front of? That's where things like OmniBOR come in. Tied to some form of an inventory, you'd be able to do a reverse mapping and say, oh, here's where everything I'm running has this particular section of code that we need to put in our intrusion protection system. Until they're patched up to a certain level, then they can start to drop off. And and so for me, like that's the not the end state or the end goal, that I think is it's a hard milestone to get to, but I think it's an important one that we can work towards, because that's something that becomes much easier to automate as well. Like,
yeah, no,
you can get it down to the point you can say, hey, Kubernetes will like enforce this for you, and sees that you're pulling in this thing. Would you like to enable the automatic mitigation? Press this button to say yes.
Yeah, no, so automated mitigation support. I know we're almost at time. One other point I was going to make that is interesting to me is that the nature of Omnibor is that things basically right now we imagine sort of get hashed at. So you have a file, the file gets, you know, has an Omnibor identifier. It is a node in the artifact dependency graph. You then have a spectrum of basically how projects decompose into files. You could imagine, you know, in theory, every source code project, like a software project, could be written in one file, in which case, if anything changes in the package, it is, you know, it gets a new ID, but it doesn't really tell you a whole lot other than, hey, something changed here, because it's all in one file. On the other extreme, you can imagine a project where every single function is its own file. And then you get, extremely granular sort of tracking of changes. And it's, it's an interesting kind of spectrum then that projects in some degree have it becomes a part of the kind of traceability of these things, or, how granular they want the tracking of these changes to be in their project for how that can become a consideration in how projects are decomposed into files. Okay, so I know we're just about at time. Were there any final points that folks wanted to raise? All right, sounds like that's it.
Cool. So with that, at the top of the hour, if there is anything that you would like to discuss, there are two places that you could do so at this particular point to reach the community. The first one is to add it to the agenda. You're always free to add something to the agenda. We can always adjust the agenda as necessary. So don't feel hesitant to add something to it that is relevant to Omnibor. The second one is the Slack channel as well. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to jump on and ask there as well. With that, I want to thank you all for your time, and we'll see you all again next week. Take care.
Awesome. Bye, y'all.
Bye.